Early 2022. Russian forces are building up on Ukraine's border. Both in Ukraine and Russia, people think that this is a ruse, because invading Ukraine would not be a rational move. Still, on February 24th, the invasion is launched. So, why did Russia invade? In this video, I will give you my theory. The video goes up in the beginning of April, as the war in Ukraine has seemingly reached a stalemate. There are many videos on the internet about this conflict, which look at the same events from different angles. My theory is that the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine was caused by two factors. I call them use force to make friends and why Putin forever. Use force begins at the end of the Cold War. At that time, Europe was divided between two factions, the Soviet bloc and the West European alliance. But the Soviet bloc collapsed, and more than 20 nations in Eastern Europe were free to choose their alliances. They could choose between Russia and the Western nations. The alignments would be determined by three things: trade, development aid, and social models. First was trade. The East Europeans produced things, and they wanted to sell them to the largest amount of people with the largest amount of money. Here, the market size was everything, and the Western nations had much larger economies than Russia, which made them the obvious choice. The East European nations had to undertake radical economic reforms, and they needed much aid to catch up with other countries. The Western economies were larger and could provide much more aid to the East Europeans. The third factor was the social model. The East European societies had recently abandoned communism and needed to choose a new model according to which to build their societies. Here too, the Russian model of powerful oligarchs and the increasing authoritarianism was not as attractive as that of the societies of Western Europe. This made the East European states favor the Western nations, which resulted in half of them joining the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. At the same time, Russia had only resources to attract Belarus into joining its institutions. But now, let's make a small detour and speculate on how the governments work. In the early 21st century, the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, steps that are now considered to be mistakes. The wrong decision might have been made because the militaries are biased towards the use of force. And the problem was that the US military had too strong an influence in the government. This made the United States lean towards launching the invasions, which might not have been the best political move. Well, in Russia, the military and the security services are effectively responsible for running the country. And this made Russia rely more on military and security services to solve its problems. Russia directed these institutions to secure its sphere of influence. The first operation was rather successful. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the new republics of Armenia and Azerbaijan began a conflict over contested territories. Although initially Armenia got the upper hand, Azerbaijan made an alliance with Turkey, which left the much smaller Armenia in a dangerous position. Russia saw this as an opportunity to use its military to expand its influence. Armenia was in need of protection, and Russia sent its forces to defend the country in return for Armenia joining the Russian sphere of influence. In the 2000s, the nation north of Armenia, Georgia, began pursuing closer ties with the Western nations, and Russia decided to use the military to bring that country into its sphere. The plan was to use the tension between the Georgian government and its two breakaway regions to inflict a military defeat on Georgia and cause a pro-Russian government to take power in the country. The operation was mostly successful. Russia was able to take full control over Georgia's separatist regions and halt Georgia's integration with the Western nations. But the invasion made many Georgians view Russia with hostility, and Georgia not only did not join the Russian sphere of influence, but also left the Russian-led institutions, which it already was a member of. Soon, another opportunity presented itself. The unrest of 2014 in Ukraine ended up with a Western-leaning government coming to power. This caused unrest in Ukraine's Russian-speaking regions. Russia deployed its military to increase its influence over Ukraine. It sent forces to help the pro-Russian separatists secure their territories against the Ukrainian army. Then Russia forced a deal upon Ukraine that these territories would rejoin Ukraine if Ukraine would be put in a position where it could not integrate with the Western nations. But the use of military force had reduced the support for Russia in Ukraine, and it refused to follow through with the deal and doubled down on its integration with the Western nations. With the previous attempt ending in failure, in 2022, Russia deployed its forces to fix this mistake. Here was the plan. Most of the Ukrainian army was deployed near the Russian border, but Russia had established full control over Belarus. If Russia launched a surprise attack on Ukraine's capital and toppled its government, the Ukrainian military would be paralyzed and the Russian forces could cross the border and take over the country. But once again, the plan did not work. The previous use of military against Ukraine had made many people in the country hostile towards Russia, which was not part of the plan. The attempt to topple Ukraine's government failed, and the Russian move to occupy the country quickly ended in a stalemate, making the first stage of the invasion a failure. In conclusion, the specific composition of the Russian government makes it biased towards using military force for solving its problems. Therefore, it tends to give its military missions that it is not good at. This partially explains why Russia sent its military to invade Ukraine in 2022 and why the Russian military is now struggling to achieve its goals. Although some of the military operations did not do much good for Russia as a country, they did benefit the Russian government, which brings us to the second reason. In 1999, Vladimir Putin managed to maneuver himself to the position of the President of the Russian Federation, a post he took to keep. And he knew just how to do that. Russia had a lot of oil. During President Putin's first term, he managed to double the amount he exported, and during the following decade, the price of oil grew more than 8 times. This gave President Putin a lot of money to spend on expanding Russia's economy. During his first term, the Russian economy grew on average in double digits a year. This gave President Putin a great approval rating, and he was re-elected with more than 70% of the vote. During Putin's next term, there was more oil money at hand, which resulted in a higher economic growth and a strong approval. Due to the term limits set by Russia's constitution, this time Putin had to share power with one of his allies. The economic performance for the third term was not as spectacular due to the 2008 economic crisis. This resulted in the reduction of some public support, but not enough to deny Putin a re-election to president. But the old strategy was breaking down. Putin was good at selling oil, but almost anyone was capable of doing that. So why should Putin be supported for another term? Fewer and fewer people could answer this question. Putin could use the state's resources to keep his ratings artificially high, but genuine support for him was entering dangerous territory. Enter the Ukrainian crisis of 2014. Ukraine had a Russian-leaning president, but by that time he had lost much of his support and he was ousted from power, which would eventually result in the election of a Western-leaning president. But not all was lost for Russia. It was not the first time a pro-Western president had come to power in the country. Last time he was replaced with a pro-Russian president, and this could happen again this time. So, Russia could just wait until the next election. But President Putin had a different agenda. He used the unrest in Russian-speaking Crimea to send his military and annex the region into Russia. This ruined the relations with Ukraine and many other nations, and resulted in sanctions imposed on Russia. The Russian economic growth slowed down, growing only 25% in the 8 years after these events, compared to the 120% before them. But this also resulted in President Putin's popularity soaring. By taking Crimea, he had finally given the people a new reason on why they should support him. You see, people, Russia is threatened by the forces from the outside, who seek to weaken it, and only President Putin can oppose them. Just look how he so cunningly snatched Crimea away from the enemy. This allowed for Putin to easily win a re-election to his 5th term. But as time passed, taking Crimea became less and less relevant and could not keep the approval high. So in order to secure his 6th term, President Putin needed to demonstrate that only he could deliver a major victory. Of course, this time he had to trump the taking of Crimea and decided to bring all of Ukraine into the fold. The achievement would give another boost to Putin's approval, and as Russian forces started moving towards Ukraine, the approval indeed began to rise and reached 83% by the time of making this video. In conclusion, Vladimir Putin needed to have the Russians think that they needed him to rule the country. During his first 3 terms, he used the rising oil prices to provide Russia with economic prosperity. But this strategy became obsolete. Then he decided to convince the people that only Putin could defeat Russia's enemies. For this, he needed to show great victories abroad. Annexation of Crimea in 2014 provided him with a large boost in popularity, but it wore off, and Putin needed an even greater victory. This time he wanted to duplicate the Crimea scenario by taking over all of Ukraine. But Ukraine was not Crimea, which resulted in the first stage of the invasion failing. But here, as this video goes up, the past stops and the future starts. I started writing this script just after the war began, and here are my predictions from that time. I am pessimistic. Barring any extreme outcomes of the fighting, the situation in Ukraine will reach some sort of stalemate without the conflict being fully settled. The public opinion in many Western nations would decisively turn against Russia. They have a strong technological superiority and a massive economic advantage, which they would use to put Russia under strong pressure. But this would make many people in Russia feel threatened, which would strengthen the power of the military and the security services. Vladimir Putin may or may not be removed from power, but this will matter little, as Russia will still be ruled by its security services, whose power would become unopposed. The relations between Russia and the Western nations would enter a new Cold War, which would last for a long time. I feel that if enough people had actively opposed the war, it would not have taken place. As I personally did not do anything to avert it, I feel that the war is a consequence of me not taking action. If the next major war is to be stopped, the reasons behind the wars are to be identified. In this video, I gave my thoughts on the origins of the conflict. I don't think that my theory is fully correct, and it may even have gotten something majorly wrong. Let me know in the comments. What do you think are the causes for the Russian invasion of Ukraine?